Hi everyone, my name is Gary Lynch. I'm a Senior Media Analyst with Olytico. For those of you who don't know us, we're a social media monitoring agency. So essentially, we help brands understand the online conversation. And we primarily do that through two ways. The first is that we provide insight-led reports that help inform the strategy for our clients. And then we also provide a tactical function where we send either text or email alerts so that our clients can know what's being said about them in real time. Some of you may know us through our support for media organizations, where we provide data, most notably for sport for business, where we look at trends in social media. And today's talk is kind of going to follow that format. We're going to look at a number of trends, both from the social media world and from a range of other data sources, and see what that tells us about the e-commerce world. So we're going to answer 5 questions today over the next 15 minutes. The first question being, is 2020 a good year to be an e-commerce brand in Ireland? How has COVID-19 affected online shoppers? What can recent trends tell us about the expectations of online consumers? Where does social media strategy fit in for e-commerce brands? And then finally, how are brands leveraging consumer expectations? So I'm going to reference these throughout the talk, and then at the end, there'll be some final notes that sum up some of the answers to these questions. So taking that first question, here's a graph based on EU data that looks at the percentage of Irish consumers who buy products online or have bought them in the past year. As you can see, over the last 7 years, there's been a strong upward trend, and particularly in the last 3 years, this figure has increased by 14%. Not only that, when we compare it to the EU average, we can see that Irish consumers are more primed to buy products online than our EU counterparts. But obviously, taking into account things that have happened this year, while this trend is interesting, I imagine a lot of people will be interested to see how COVID-19 specifically has affected e-commerce. So we're going to take a look at that now. So this is data from the Tipping Point report from the Irish Domains Registry, where they surveyed consumers about their use of online technologies. So just under half of their respondents felt that they spent more money online since the COVID-19 crisis began in Ireland. And just under 3/4 of respondents believe social distancing measures will affect their likelihood of shopping in store. So we're going to take a look at some financial data and some behavioral data in the next few slides. But I'd just like to stress at this point, what I find particularly interesting is that these two figures really highlight that perceptions towards shopping online and shopping in store have changed in response to COVID-19. So taking a look at some of that financial data, the source of this comes from Visa's monthly consumer spending reports in Ireland. And what we can see here is that general consumer spending, if we were to sum up what this graph says, is that COVID-19 caused a large initial shock to consumer spending, but the current trend is positive as we move into July, where compared to this time last year, there's more consumer spending than there was in the previous 2019's July. But we're not here just to talk about general consumer spending. We want to focus in on e-commerce. So when we layer that data in, we can see a slightly different story, which can be best summed up in that e-commerce was affected earlier by COVID-19. So the big shock for e-commerce came in March, but that e-commerce recovered much more quickly than general markets in Ireland. But COVID-19 didn't just affect how much people spent online, but it also affected the types of products people were buying online too. So at the start of every year, the CSO in Ireland collects data on what people are buying online. So that was conducted in January. And then when COVID-19 took hold in Ireland in March, they reran the survey. And I think some of the differences in responses make for some really interesting reading. So in terms of product groups that saw increases, computers, tablets, and mobile phones, cosmetics, beauty and wellness products, and ebooks and online news all saw modest growth over that period. Home and garden supplies and furniture and film and TV streaming services also saw growth just around the 60% mark. And then the largest increase in terms of what people were buying online over that period came from fitness and health apps, which, while it came from quite a low base, increased 160%. This is likely driven by the fact that those who would have previously gone to gyms didn't have access to gyms over this period. So now that we've looked at the product categories that people are buying, we were also interested in looking at how consumers were accessing online shopping. So this is data drawn from the PwC Irish Consumer Insight Report. And the graph on the left, the yellow bars represent those who used PC to access online shopping, and the orange represents those who use tablets, and the red focuses on those who use mobile phones and smartphones. And that's the group we're going to focus in on, particularly because between 2018 and 2019, the percentage of Irish consumers making regular purchases via mobile doubled. Not only that, paying in store with a mobile device, for example, using Apple Pay or Google Pay, increased by 38% among Irish consumers. So from this, it's clear that mobile is playing an increasing role in terms of online and in-store purchases. But the big question is, what influences mobile purchases? If more people are using their mobile to buy products, how do we reach them? And thankfully, the PwC report has some interesting points, data points on that also. So the first piece they highlight is that 15% of their respondents in Ireland had made a purchase directly through a social media platform. 25% browse social media to look for inspiration for purchases. And 28% have been influenced to buy a product after reading a positive review through a social media platform. And this data is particularly interesting when we look at the next graph that talks about the conversation on social media in Ireland. So this is Olytico data that focuses on Twitter. It runs from September 2019 up to September 2020. And we can see here, as the announcement of lockdown measures due to COVID-19 occurred during March, the conversation on Twitter in Ireland saw a significant increase. And in fact, that increase has been sustained throughout this period. So we haven't seen the conversation online return to the levels of pre-COVID-19. And we've seen this across social media platforms. Twitter is just the example that we're pulling out here. But this begs a question. So if consumers are using social media to make purchasing decisions, and there's more conversation socially in Ireland than there has been in the last number of periods, how can e-commerce brands leverage that increase in conversation? So we're going to look at a number of ways of doing this, and in particular, what consumers who talk socially, what do they engage with? And we're going to back this up with a number of findings from a number of the reports that we've already talked about. The first of which comes from the Tipping Point report, where 95% of the consumers they surveyed said that supporting small and local businesses through COVID-19 has been important to them. From the PwC report we referenced earlier, just over 50% of the consumers they spoke to tried to avoid plastics where possible. And 59% of global respondents to the Ipsos MRBI 2019 Consumer Insights report try to buy products from brands that act responsibly, even if that means spending more than they otherwise would. So taking all this into account and looking at the wider social conversation in Ireland, we believe that consumers want to shop in an ethical way. And in particular, we would frame this as the idea of a conscious consumer. So we're now going to take these data points from these reports, and we're going to look at how brands can apply these through social media. So first off is this point around supporting small and local business through COVID-19. And we've seen this reflected on social media in Ireland. So if when we looked in Q1 of 2020, hashtag Buy Local and Buy Irish were used in approximately 1,000 tweets. And when we compare that to Q2, the use of those hashtags had tripled. So it's not just consumers who are using this conversation. Campaigns have become involved. So that includes Champion Green and Lean On Me that have looked to capitalize on this desire from consumers to support small and local businesses. And we've also seen it from influencers. So I'm sure a lot of us would associate influencers with paid activations, but that's not always the case. And as I pull down the left-hand side of this slide, this is an example of a small Irish business who's received a mention from an influencer, and they've taken that and they've expanded the reach of the content by using these hashtags, by tagging in Champions Green and Support Local, to seed that out to a wider audience. But obviously not everyone listening today is a small business. So what can you do if you're not an SME business and you want to leverage off this conversation? So what we've seen is that some businesses are using their social presence to highlight their support for small businesses. And we've pulled out the example of Virgin Media and their hashtag Backing Business campaign, and the aim of which was to help local Irish businesses promote themselves throughout the tough months of the pandemic. And while this activation has a positive and it's a values-driven activation, it has also driven over 1,000 additional brand mentions for Virgin Media over that period. So while the purpose of it is to live their brand values and to support small companies, there's the additional benefit that consumers are engaging with this as a values-based campaign. And we can see this reflected across e-commerce businesses. So in terms of Shopify and that piece from the PwC report around environmentalism, when their CEO contributed to an initiative, a tree planting initiative, the conversation that drove was 5 times larger than the brand's average mention. So it drove a huge conversation in relation to the conversation that Shopify generally drive on social media. And this last piece is probably the most difficult because what does active responsibly mean? Well, it can mean different things for different brands and for different consumers. However, what we've seen is universal, is that consumers want to see brands acting authentically and pursuing their brand values. So we're going to take an example from Groupon, who on a single day drove over 13,000 Twitter mentions for their brand. To put that in context, a typical day for Groupon on Twitter is about 700 tweets. So this is the spike you can see here just above the June 2020 mark. And what Groupon did was they gave control of their account to writer and activist Clarkeisha Kent at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, and allowed her to expand the reach of her voice using their platform. So while this is quite a high profile and potentially divisive way of living your brand values through social, what it does show is that conscious consumers are active via social, and that they will support and engage with brands that they feel are acting responsibly. So I'm going to finish up with some final notes that relate back into those questions that we highlighted at the start of the talk. So first question was, is 2020 a good year for e-commerce brands in Ireland? And what we've seen is that in recent years, more Irish consumers than ever have started to shop online. The second question was, how has COVID-19 affected online shoppers? And we saw that while COVID-19 had a negative effect on spending, e-commerce spending has bounced back faster than other markets, and the trend currently is quite positive. Third question was, what can recent trends tell us about the expectations of online consumers? And we saw that consumers have higher expectations than ever, particularly in relationship to responsibility and ethics. And COVID-19 has driven that, particularly in relation to how consumers feel about small businesses. The fourth question was, where does social media strategy fit in for e-commerce brands? And COVID-19 has significantly increased the level of social media conversation in Ireland, and we would see that as an opportunity for brands to get involved with. And finally, how are brands leveraging consumer expectations? Well, brands are driving engagement by highlighting their values through social media, and we would think that's a really positive way of driving engagement for your brand. So if you have any questions about any of the topics that we've touched on, or would like links to any of the reports that were drawn on for this presentation, you can send me an email, as you can see here, or if you have any questions about Olytico as a brand. Thank you.